9 signs you'll see just before anxiety turns into your deepest strength. Carl Jung. There's a secret hidden in plain sight, buried beneath decades of pharmaceutical marketing and clinical diagnosis, a truth so radical that modern psychiatry has spent the last century systematically erasing it from our collective consciousness. Carl Jung discovered it over 100 years ago, documented it meticulously in his clinical work, and then watched as the mental health industry chose profit over transformation, pathology over potential. Here's what they don't want you to know. Your anxiety isn't a disorder. It isn't evidence of chemical imbalance, genetic defect, or neurological malfunction. Your anxiety is power, raw, unformed, desperate power, trapped in the prison of your unconscious mind, screaming to break free, and the intensity of your suffering is directly proportional to the magnitude of the strength trying to be born through you. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. Every panic attack you've endured, every sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling with your heart racing, every moment you've felt like you're drowning in an ocean of nameless dread. Those weren't signs that something is wrong with you. They were signs that something extraordinary is trying to happen to you, and your current identity is too small, too rigid, too terrified to let it through. Jung spent decades working with patients who came to him labeled as hopeless cases, people crippled by what we now call generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety, obsessive-compulsive patterns. These were individuals who had tried everything: multiple therapists, various medications, behavioral interventions, relaxation techniques. Nothing worked because everyone was treating the anxiety as the problem, when Jung saw clearly that anxiety was the solution the psyche was offering. In his private notes, Jung wrote something that would never make it into a modern DSM manual. The most anxious patients, once they completed the individuation work, became the most powerful artists, leaders, healers, visionaries. Their anxiety was not pathology, but dormant greatness, pressing against the walls of a life too small to contain it. Think about what this means. Jung wasn't observing that anxious people got better and then became successful. He was saying that the same energy creating their anxiety was the seed of their future power. The panic attacks, the obsessive thoughts, the physical symptoms of terror, all of it was potential genius trying to break through but having nowhere to go, like electricity without a conductor, like a river dammed up until the pressure becomes unbearable. The pharmaceutical industry has built a multi-billion-dollar empire on the premise that your anxiety is an enemy to be defeated, a malfunction to be corrected. They need you to believe you're broken, so you'll keep buying the fix. But what if you're not broken? What if you're breaking open? What if every symptom you've been taught to suppress is actually a signpost pointing toward the most powerful version of yourself? This isn't positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. This is hard-won clinical observation from one of the greatest psychological minds in history. Jung tracked pattern after pattern, the writer paralyzed by fear of judgment, who, once he integrated his anxiety, produced work that changed his field. The teacher crippled by social anxiety, who transformed into a speaker capable of holding thousands in rapt attention. The businessman frozen by decision-making panic, who became a visionary leader once he understood what his psyche was actually trying to tell him. Every single one of them experienced what Jung called the reversal, the moment when anxiety stopped being their enemy and revealed itself as their ally. Not their comfortable ally, not their gentle ally, but their most fierce and devoted ally, willing to make their current life absolutely unbearable until they were forced to evolve into something greater. You're watching this video because some part of you suspects this might be true. Some part of you has wondered why your anxiety feels so significant, so loaded with meaning, so impossible to ignore. You've tried to make it go away, tried to medicate it into silence, tried to manage it with breathing exercises and positive affirmations, and still it persists. Still it wakes you at 3 in the morning. Still it grips your chest when you think about certain things. Still it whispers that your current life isn't enough. What if it's been right all along? In this exploration, I'm going to reveal 9 specific signs that appear when anxiety is on the verge of transformation into strength. These aren't random symptoms or coincidental patterns. They're the psychological equivalent of labor pains, unmistakable indicators that something is being born. Jung recognized them across hundreds of case studies. Modern Jungian analysts see them in their clients today. And once you learn to recognize them, you'll never see your anxiety the same way again. These 9 signs are the roadmap your unconscious has been desperately trying to show you. They appear in a sequence, building on each other, creating the conditions for what Jung called the transcendent function. The psyche's miraculous ability to unite opposites, to transform fear into power, to alchemize suffering into strength. Each sign is a threshold. Each one asks you to see yourself differently, to question what you thought you knew about your anxiety, to consider the possibility that you've been standing at the doorway to your greatest life and mistaking it for a prison cell. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your anxiety has been so persistent, so specific, so impossible to simply fix. You'll recognize it for what it truly is: the friction of your becoming, the pressure of potential, the labor pains of your most powerful self trying to be born. And you'll know with the kind of certainty that changes everything that you were never weak for feeling this way. You were strong enough to feel what others suppress. You were sensitive enough to detect what others ignore. You were chosen by your own psyche to undergo a transformation most people will never have the courage to face. How long have you been anxious? 3 years? 5? 10? 20? That's how long your power has been waiting. That's how long the greatest version of you has been knocking on the door of consciousness, waiting for you to finally understand what all this suffering has been preparing you for. Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Your pain has not been meaningless. Your anxiety has not been random. Every symptom has been a message. Every panic attack has been an initiation. Every sleepless night has been preparation. The question isn't whether you'll transform your anxiety into strength. The question is, are you ready to see the signs that prove your transformation is already beginning? Let's find out. Before we can recognize the signs of transformation, we need to understand exactly what we're up against. Because the reason you haven't transformed your anxiety yet isn't because you're not trying hard enough, and it isn't because your anxiety is uniquely resistant to change. It's because you've been sold a lie so pervasive, so profitable, so embedded in our cultural understanding of mental health that most people never question it. The lie is this: anxiety is a brain disease that requires medication, a behavioral disorder that requires management, or a genetic curse that requires lifelong coping. The lie says that if you're anxious, something in your neurochemistry has malfunctioned, something in your cognitive patterns has gone wrong, something in your family history has doomed you to suffer. And the solution, according to this lie, is to make the anxiety go away, to medicate it, manage it, suppress it, cope with it indefinitely until, hopefully, it becomes tolerable enough that you can live something approximating a normal life. This isn't a critique of medication or therapy. There are times and situations where both are necessary and helpful. This is a critique of the framework itself, the fundamental assumption that anxiety is pure pathology, that it has no meaning, carries no message, serves no purpose beyond making you miserable. This framework benefits a medical industrial complex that generates billions in profit every year by keeping you symptomatic, by treating anxiety as a chronic condition to be managed rather than a threshold to be crossed. Carl Jung had a radically different understanding, one that earned him both reverence and ridicule from the psychiatric establishment of his time. He saw anxiety not as a disease, but as energy without direction, not as malfunction, but as power without purpose, not as pathology, but as suffering that carries meaning. Let me explain what this means in practical terms. When Jung worked with anxious patients, he didn't ask, "What's wrong with your brain chemistry?" He asked, "What is your unconscious trying to tell you? What part of yourself are you refusing to acknowledge? What potential are you suppressing? What truth are you unwilling to face?" He discovered something extraordinary. In almost every case, chronic anxiety was the psyche's response to living below one's potential. It was what happened when someone's conscious life, their job, relationships, daily routines, self-concept, was fundamentally misaligned with who they actually were at the deepest level. The anxiety wasn't the malfunction. The anxiety was the alarm system alerting them to the misalignment. Think of it this way. Imagine you're living in a house designed for someone else. Walls that are too close, ceilings that are too low, rooms that serve purposes you have no use for. At first, you try to adapt. You hunch your shoulders, lower your head, ignore the discomfort. But over time, the physical constraint becomes unbearable. Your body starts to protest. Back pain, headaches, a constant sense of being cramped. These symptoms aren't diseases. They're your body's accurate response to an unsuitable environment. The solution isn't to medicate away the pain. The solution is to find or build a house that actually fits you. Jung saw that anxiety works the same way psychologically. When your conscious life is too small for your actual self, when you're living according to what you should be rather than what you are, when you've repressed your real desires, denied your authentic power, suppressed your genuine voice, your psyche begins to rebel, and it rebels through anxiety. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and where Jung's insight becomes genuinely radical. The psyche doesn't just create anxiety as a general alert. It creates specific anxiety with specific intensity, proportional to the specific potential being suppressed. The energy that would have gone into living your actual life, pursuing your real calling, expressing your authentic self, claiming your genuine power, that energy doesn't disappear when you suppress it. It gets trapped in your unconscious, and it manifests as anxiety symptoms. Jung wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." Let that phrase settle. What he meant was that anxiety, panic, obsessive thoughts, compulsions, these are the psyche's substitute for the productive suffering involved in growth, change, and transformation. When you refuse to suffer consciously, to feel the discomfort of changing, of risking, of becoming, you end up suffering unconsciously through symptoms that seem meaningless and endless. The modern medical model treats this backwards. It sees the symptoms as the problem and tries to eliminate them. But Jung understood that the symptoms are the solution the psyche is offering. They're not random misfires, they're precisely calibrated messages. You're living wrong, you're thinking too small, you're playing it too safe, you're betraying your own potential. Now, here's why this matters urgently for you. Our culture doesn't just medicalize anxiety, it pathologizes intensity itself. We've created a society that rewards compliance, consistency, predictability, and comfort. A society that trains people to fit into systems rather than building systems that honor people. A society that values productivity over meaning, security over authenticity, conformity over individuation. If you're naturally intense, if you feel things deeply, if you have access to your unconscious through intuition or creativity or sensitivity, if you're capable of profound transformation, this culture will make you anxious. Not because something is wrong with you, but because everything is wrong with the systems you're trying to fit into. Your anxiety is your psyche's accurate assessment. that you don't belong in a life built for someone else. Jung warned that a sick society will call its healthiest members sick. He watched it happen in his own time, as the mechanization of life and the rise of mass consciousness created epidemic levels of neurosis among the most sensitive, thoughtful, and potentially creative individuals. Those who couldn't adapt to increasingly soulless conditions weren't defective. They were canaries in the coal mine, their anxiety signaling that something had gone profoundly wrong with collective values. The statistics today are staggering. Anxiety disorders are now the most common mental health condition globally, affecting hundreds of millions of people. Medication rates have skyrocketed. Therapy waitlists stretch for months. Self-help content about anxiety generates billions of views, and yet the rates keep climbing. More medication, more therapy, more coping strategies, more awareness campaigns, and more people suffering than ever before. What if the epidemic isn't happening because we're not treating anxiety well enough? What if it's happening because we're treating it as a disease when it's actually an evolutionary signal? What if millions of people are anxious because they're being called to transform, to individuate, to become who they actually are, and the culture has given them no framework for doing so? What if, instead of mass mental illness, we're witnessing mass potential pressing against the constraints of systems that can no longer contain human consciousness? This is Jung's most suppressed insight. Your anxiety isn't evidence that you're defective. It's evidence that you're evolving, and the world as currently structured cannot accommodate your evolution. The pain you feel isn't malfunction. It's outgrowing. Let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying anxiety feels good or that you should just embrace it without doing anything. I'm not saying medication or therapy are wrong or that you should suffer needlessly. What I'm saying is that the framework matters. If you believe your anxiety is a disease to be cured, you'll spend your life managing symptoms. But if you understand your anxiety is trapped potential seeking expression, you have a completely different task: transformation. The viewer's real suffering doesn't come from having anxiety. It comes from believing anxiety makes them broken, from spending years, sometimes decades, trying to fix something that was never broken to begin with, from medicating away the very energy they need to transform their lives, from coping with a life that should have been changed, not coped with. Here's the core tension Jung identified, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Your conscious mind wants the anxiety gone. Your unconscious is using anxiety to get your attention because you're living below your potential. These two forces are in direct conflict, and that conflict is most of what you're experiencing as anxiety symptoms. Your ego, your conscious sense of self, wants comfort, predictability, the life you've built. Yourself, the totality of your being, including your unrealized potential, wants transformation, actualization, the life you're meant to live. The anxiety is the war between them, and you won't win that war by helping the ego suppress the self. You win by helping the ego surrender to the self's legitimate demands. That surrender, that's where transformation begins. So before we explore the 9 signs that your transformation is near, you need to make a choice. You can continue treating your anxiety as the enemy, using every tool available to suppress it, and you'll probably get some relief. Many people do this their whole lives. The anxiety becomes more manageable, life becomes more tolerable, and they die never knowing what they were actually capable of becoming. Or you can consider the possibility that Jung was right, that your anxiety is your unrealized greatness trying to break through, that every symptom is a signpost, that the energy creating your suffering is the exact same energy that will create your strength once you learn how to transform it rather than suppress it. This isn't a comfortable choice. Jung never promised comfort. He promised consciousness. He promised that if you were brave enough to face what your anxiety was actually telling you if you were willing to undergo the suffering of transformation rather than the suffering of staying stuck, you would discover capacities within yourself that would astound you. But here's the final piece of this framework, the piece that makes it urgent rather than just interesting. Your anxiety is getting worse because your potential is getting louder. The fact that you're watching this video means some part of you already knows this. The fact that nothing has worked so far isn't because you're resistant to treatment. It's because your psyche is refusing to be treated. It's demanding to be transformed. How much longer are you going to fight the wrong battle? How many more years are you going to try to eliminate the very energy that's meant to elevate you? How much more time are you going to spend trying to fit into a life that was never meant for you in the first place? Your anxiety has been trying to tell you something all along. It's been trying to tell you that you're living too small, that you're thinking too safe, that you're playing a game you were never meant to play. And the signs I'm about to reveal aren't just interesting psychological phenomena. They're your psyche's final attempts to get your attention before either breakthrough or breakdown. Jung said it clearly. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. You've been facing your anxiety for years. Now it's time to face what's behind it. Now it's time to recognize the signs that your suffering has always been preparation for something you can barely imagine from where you currently stand. Your anxiety isn't the problem. Believing it is, that's the problem. And it's the one problem that must be solved before any real transformation can begin. Are you ready to see what your anxiety has been protecting all along? Now that you understand anxiety isn't a disease but trapped potential, you need to understand the precise psychological mechanics of how that potential becomes anxiety and how anxiety, when properly engaged, transforms into strength. This isn't mystical. This isn't metaphorical. This is Jung's empirical observation of the psyche's actual functioning, confirmed across thousands of hours of clinical work and refined through his own personal descent into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Here's the fundamental mechanism. Jung discovered that the psyche is not a simple, unified thing. It operates through what he called a dynamic system of conscious and unconscious contents in constant interaction. Your conscious mind, what you think of as you, is only a small fraction of your total psychological reality. Beneath consciousness lies the vast unconscious, a realm containing everything you've repressed, denied, forgotten, or never knew about yourself. This includes traumatic memories and uncomfortable truths. Yes, but it also contains, and this is what most people miss, your unrealized potential. Think about that. Your greatest strengths, your most profound gifts, your deepest capacities, your authentic power. If these haven't been developed and integrated into your conscious identity, they exist as unconscious contents. They're there, alive, active, pressing against the boundary between unconscious and conscious, trying to break through, and when they can't break through because your ego resists, because your current identity is too rigid, because your self-concept can't accommodate them, they manifest as anxiety. Jung called these unconscious contents complexes, autonomous psychological structures with their own energy, their own intelligence, their own agenda. When a complex holds potential power that your conscious ego has denied, it doesn't just sit quietly in the unconscious. It acts, it pushes, it creates pressure. And that pressure, when it can't successfully bring the content into consciousness, gets experienced as anxiety symptoms. Here's an analogy that makes this concrete. Imagine you're living in a house, and beneath that house is a basement you've locked and forgotten about. In that basement lives a version of yourself that possesses capabilities you've never developed. Maybe it's the you who can speak truth fearlessly, or the you who can create art without caring what others think, or the you who can lead without seeking approval. This basement you has the same vital energy you do. It's alive, it's conscious in its own way, and it knows you're living above it, pretending it doesn't exist, while your surface life grows smaller, safer, more constrained. At first, basement you knocks politely. You ignore it. The knock feels uncomfortable, disruptive to your carefully constructed life. So basement you knocks louder, still ignored. Now basement you starts pounding on the floor, causing the whole house to shake. You feel this shaking as anxiety, as racing heart, churning thoughts, inexplicable dread. You call it a panic attack. You medicate it. You develop coping strategies, but basement you isn't trying to hurt you. Basement you is trying to get your attention, trying to tell you that there's a whole part of your being that's being wasted in darkness, while you live a half-life above. This is Jung's theory of unconscious contents pressing against consciousness. The energy creating your anxiety is the same energy that will create your strength. It's just trapped on the wrong side of the threshold. Anxiety is what happens when power can't find its way into your conscious life, so it manifests as symptoms in your body and mind, demanding to be noticed. Now here's where this gets even more precise. Jung observed that the intensity of anxiety directly corresponds to the magnitude of the repressed content. Small anxieties, mild worry, minor stress usually indicate surface-level concerns. A difficult conversation ahead, a deadline approaching, a social situation you're not comfortable with. But massive, persistent, debilitating anxiety, the kind that wakes you at 3 a.m., the kind that makes your heart race for no apparent reason, the kind that makes you feel like you're dying when nothing external is threatening you. That level of anxiety indicates something massive in the unconscious trying to emerge. This is why highly anxious people, once they complete the integration work, often become extraordinarily powerful individuals. The anxiety wasn't proportional to their weakness. It was proportional to their potential. They were suffering so intensely because what was trying to be born through them was so significant. Jung used the metaphor of birth deliberately and repeatedly. He talked about psychological transformation as a birth process, painful, dangerous, unavoidable once it begins. Your anxiety, in this framework, is psychological labor pain. Something massive is trying to move from unconscious to conscious, from potential to actual, from latent to expressed. And just like physical birth, the process hurts precisely because something real is happening. Something is actually moving through a threshold it's never crossed before. The ego, your current sense of who you are, experiences this as terrifying because birth is death for the old form. The caterpillar doesn't get to remain caterpillar and become butterfly. It has to dissolve completely in the chrysalis, its entire structure breaking down before the new form can emerge. Psychologically, this is what's happening when anxiety intensifies. Your old identity is being asked to dissolve, so a new identity, one capable of holding your actual power, can form. Jung called this process the transcendent function. It's the psyche's innate capacity to unite opposites into a new synthesis. Right now, you have two opposites in conflict: your conscious ego, small, scared, familiar, and your unconscious potential, large, powerful, unknown. These two are at war, and that war is most of what you experience as anxiety. The transcendent function is what allows these opposites to meet, dialogue, and ultimately unite into something new. A consciousness that can hold both safety and power, both stability and transformation. But here's the critical point. The transcendent function doesn't activate automatically. It requires consciousness to participate. You have to know this process is happening. You have to recognize that your anxiety isn't random but meaningful. You have to engage with it rather than simply trying to make it stop. This is why understanding the mechanics matters, not as intellectual knowledge, but as lived awareness that changes how you relate to your own experience. Jung spent years studying alchemy because he recognized that the alchemists were describing psychological transformation using chemical metaphors. They talked about taking base metal, unconscious, unrealized potential, and transforming it through various stages into gold, conscious, actualized power. The first stage always was the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the breaking down of the old form. This stage was dark, difficult, felt like death, but it was absolutely necessary because you can't transform something without first breaking its current structure. Your anxiety is the nigredo. It's the psychological blackening, the dissolution of your old identity, the breakdown of your too small life. It feels like death because in a real sense, it is death. Death of who you thought you were, death of the life you thought you'd live, death of the safety you thought you'd maintain. And the reason you can't just medicate it away or manage it indefinitely is that it's not a malfunction. It's stage one of alchemical transformation. If you stop the process here, you remain in the darkness. But if you continue through, you reach the next stages: albedo, purification, clarity, and finally rubedo, transformation, power, the emergence of the new self. The energy that's creating your panic attacks, your obsessive thoughts, your physical symptoms, that energy is immense. It has to be immense because it's the energy that will eventually power your actual life. But right now, it's like having a nuclear reactor with no grid to channel the power. The energy builds, creates heat and pressure, and manifests as symptoms your body can feel, but your mind can't understand. This is why resistance intensifies suffering. Every time you resist the transformation, every time you try to force yourself back into your old life, your old identity, your old limitations, you're essentially blocking a river that's meant to flow. The water doesn't stop coming. It just builds up behind the dam until the pressure becomes unbearable. Anxiety symptoms escalate not because the anxiety is getting worse, but because what's trying to emerge is getting stronger, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." The pain he's talking about isn't the pain of anxiety symptoms. That's actually the lesser pain, the pain you experience when you resist. The real pain he's pointing to is the pain of transformation itself, the discomfort of seeing yourself clearly, the fear of claiming power you've always denied, the terror of actually becoming who you're capable of being. Most people choose the pain of anxiety symptoms because it's familiar. They'll live decades with panic attacks, insomnia, racing thoughts, because that pain doesn't require change. The pain of transformation, on the other hand, requires you to die to your current self. It requires you to admit you've been living wrong, thinking small, playing safe. It requires you to risk everything you've built for something you can't see yet. That's a harder pain to choose, but it's the only pain that ends in liberation rather than endless management. Here's what happens mechanically when you engage with anxiety as trapped power rather than pure pathology. First, you bring consciousness to the experience. Instead of just feeling anxious and trying to make it stop, you observe it, you inquire into it. You ask what it's trying to tell you. This act of conscious attention already changes the dynamic. You're no longer purely identified with the anxiety, and you're no longer purely trying to eliminate it. You're in a third position, witnessing the conflict between your conscious ego and your unconscious potential. Second, you begin to identify the specific content that's trying to emerge. What exactly is your anxiety about? Not just the surface trigger, the social situation, the decision, the responsibility, but the deeper pattern. What capability are you afraid of? What power are you denying? What truth are you suppressing? Jung's entire clinical method was built on helping patients answer these questions, and the answers were never what the patients expected. The social anxiety wasn't really about other people. It was about the patient's own disowned power to influence and lead. The performance anxiety wasn't really about failure. It was about the patient's denied desire to be seen and celebrated. The decision-making paralysis wasn't really about making wrong choices. It was about the patient's refusal to claim authority over their own life. Third, and this is where transformation actually happens, you begin to embody the disowned content consciously. You don't just understand intellectually that you have power. You exercise power. You don't just recognize you have a voice. You use your voice. You don't just accept you're meant for something greater. You take action towards something greater. This is terrifying for the ego because it means actually changing, actually risking, actually becoming different. But it's the only thing that completes the circuit and allows the energy to flow from unconscious to conscious, from potential to actualized, from anxiety to strength. Jung saw this pattern so many times he could predict it. A patient would come in, anxious and suffering. They'd resist the work, insist they just wanted the anxiety to stop, try every avoidance strategy. But if they stayed with the process, eventually they'd hit a moment of recognition. Oh, my anxiety has been trying to tell me I'm supposed to be doing something completely different with my life. And then, if they had courage, they'd take one small action in alignment with that recognition. Immediately, and Jung documented this, the anxiety would lessen, not because it was managed, but because it was no longer needed. The message had been received. The content was moving from unconscious to conscious. The birth process had begun. This is why anxiety precedes power with such reliability. It's not that suffering magically turns into strength. It's that the energy creating the suffering is strength. It's just trapped, misunderstood, manifesting as symptoms because it has nowhere else to go. Once you create a conscious pathway for that energy, once you give it direction, purpose, expression, it stops being anxiety and becomes what it always was. Your power, your potential, your actual life force finally able to flow where it was always meant to go. The transcendent function is the mechanism by which this happens. It's not something you do deliberately like a technique. It's something that happens naturally when you hold the tension between opposites, consciously rather than trying to eliminate one side. When you can sit with both your fear and your longing, both your current identity and your potential identity, both your desire for safety and your calling toward risk. When you can hold all of this without collapsing into either pole, the psyche does something miraculous. It produces a third thing, a synthesis, a new possibility that transcends the original conflict. This is individuation in motion. This is how anxiety transforms into strength. Not by force, not by suppression, not by management, but by conscious engagement with the actual psychological process that's already underway, whether you're aware of it or not. And here's why this matters urgently. The 9 signs I'm about to reveal are the milestones of this process. They're the evidence that the transcendent function is activating, that the transformation is already beginning, that you're standing at the threshold whether you realize it or not. Each sign indicates a specific stage of the unconscious content, moving toward consciousness, of potential becoming actualized, of anxiety preparing to become strength. Once you know these signs, once you can recognize them in your own experience, you'll understand with brutal clarity you're not having a breakdown, you're having a breakthrough, and the pain you're in isn't meaningless. It's the most meaningful pain you'll ever experience, the pain of your actual self being born. Jung spent his entire life trying to communicate this truth. Your anxiety isn't the enemy. Your resistance to transformation is the enemy. Your anxiety is the ally, crude and painful as it is, trying to force you toward the life you're actually meant to live. Now let's look at the specific signs that prove this transformation is already beginning. The first sign that your anxiety is about to transform into strength is so specific, so precise, that once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. Your anxiety stops being this vague, generalized dread, that floating sense of something's wrong that attaches to everything and nothing, and suddenly becomes weirdly, almost absurdly specific. You might have spent years with generalized anxiety, waking up each morning with that familiar knot in your stomach, the sense that catastrophe is always just around the corner, but you can't name what catastrophe or why. That's the anxiety of unconscious content pressing generally against consciousness, creating pressure everywhere, overwhelming your whole system. But then something shifts. The anxiety concentrates. It lasers in on something particular. Public speaking when you've never needed to speak publicly before. Visibility when you've spent your whole life being intentionally invisible. Leadership when you've always been a follower. Money when your financial situation hasn't actually changed. Starting a business when you've always been an employee. Writing when you've never written anything. Being seen when you've hidden your whole life. This isn't random. This is your unconscious revealing with surgical precision exactly what you're being called to do. The specificity is the map. Your psyche isn't torturing you with random fears. It's showing you the exact threshold you need to cross, the specific capacity you need to develop, the precise power you're meant to claim. Jung recognized this pattern in his clinical work so consistently that he came to rely on it diagnostically. When a patient's anxiety became highly specific, he knew transformation was imminent if they could summon the courage to move toward what the anxiety was highlighting rather than running away from it. Let me tell you about Marcus. He came to see a Jungian analyst after 3 years of increasingly debilitating anxiety. He'd tried medication, cognitive behavioral therapy, meditation, everything. The anxiety would sometimes lessen, but never fully resolved. Then, about 6 months before he sought Jungian help, something strange happened. His generalized anxiety began concentrating into a specific terror of public speaking. This confused Marcus because he worked in accounting. He spent his days with numbers, spreadsheets, solitary work. He had no need to speak publicly, no presentations to give, no reason this fear should even exist. But it became obsessive. He'd lie awake at night imagining scenarios where he'd have to speak in front of groups. He'd have panic attacks at the mere thought of being asked to present something in a meeting. He started avoiding any situation where he might be called upon to speak, even among friends. His analyst asked him a simple question that changed everything. What if your psyche is trying to tell you that you're meant to be a speaker? Marcus's first reaction was to laugh. Him? A speaker? He was terrified of public speaking. He'd rather die than get on a stage. How could he possibly be meant to do the thing that terrified him most? But his analyst helped him understand. The terror wasn't evidence against the calling. The terror was evidence for it. Jung taught that we're most afraid of claiming the power we're actually meant to wield. The ego resists because it knows that claiming that power will require a complete transformation of identity. Marcus's entire self-concept was built on being quiet, behind the scenes, analytical, invisible. Becoming a speaker would require him to become someone entirely different. So they worked with the anxiety rather than trying to eliminate it. They treated it as communication from Marcus's unconscious, showing him his next evolution. Within a year, Marcus had joined Toastmasters. Within 2 years, he was speaking at accounting conferences. Within 3 years, he'd built a side business teaching accountants how to communicate financial concepts to non-financial audiences. The anxiety didn't go away immediately, but its quality changed completely. It transformed from debilitating panic into excited nervousness, the kind of activation that meant he was doing something meaningful rather than something terrifying. Here's what's crucial to understand. Marcus's public speaking anxiety didn't emerge because he was getting worse. It emerged because he was getting ready. His psyche knew long before his conscious mind could accept it that he had something to say, something to teach, something to offer that required a completely different expression than his current life allowed. The specific anxiety was the unconscious mind's way of preparing him, alerting him, marking the exact territory he needed to explore. This pattern shows up everywhere once you know to look for it. Jennifer was a graphic designer who'd spent 15 years working for other people's companies, creating other people's visions. She was good at her job, reliable, skilled, but around age 37, she developed a specific, inexplicable anxiety about visibility. Not social anxiety in general. She could attend parties, have conversations, function normally in most social contexts. But the thought of putting her own work out into the world, of being seen as a creator rather than an executor, filled her with nauseating dread. She started having panic attacks when she thought about starting an Instagram account for her personal art. She'd wake up at night with her heart racing, imagining people judging her work, criticizing her style, rejecting what she created. This made no logical sense. She'd been creating professional work for years without this level of anxiety. Why would sharing her personal work be different? Her therapist, trained in Jungian approaches, helped her see the anxiety wasn't about the practical act of posting art online. It was about claiming her identity as an artist rather than a service provider, about being seen for who she actually was rather than what she could do for others, about stepping out of the shadow of other people's visions and standing in the light of her own. The specificity of the anxiety, visibility, not socializing, personal work, not professional work, being seen as herself, not as a functionary, was showing her exactly what her soul was demanding. She was being called to visibility. She was being called to claim her creative identity publicly. She was being called to stop hiding behind other people's brands and build her own. When Jennifer finally understood this, when she recognized her anxiety as a calling rather than a curse, she made a terrifying choice. She started posting her personal work. The anxiety was intense at first. Every post felt like walking naked through a crowded room. But something remarkable happened. The more she did it, the more the anxiety transformed into something else. Not comfort exactly, but aliveness, presence, the feeling of finally being herself in public rather than performing a role. Within 18 months, Jennifer had left her design job and was supporting herself through her personal art. The anxiety about visibility didn't disappear entirely. Even now, years later, she feels nervous when she posts something vulnerable. But the quality is completely different. It's the nervousness of someone showing up authentically rather than the terror of someone hiding from their own life. This is the pattern. Specific anxiety emerges precisely where you're meant to go. The thing that terrifies you most specifically is almost always pointing directly at your calling. Why does this happen? Jung's explanation is elegant. As unconscious contents gain enough energy and pressure to break through into consciousness, they begin sending targeted signals. The unconscious doesn't speak in abstract concepts. It speaks in images, emotions, and specific fears that correspond to specific realities. When you're meant to speak, you become anxious about speaking. When you're meant to lead, you become anxious about visibility and authority. When you're meant to create, you become anxious about judgment and criticism. When you're meant to build something of your own, you become anxious about money, security, independence. The specificity is precision-guided. Your psyche isn't generating random fears to torment you. It's highlighting, with laser accuracy, the exact capability you need to develop, the precise threshold you need to cross. And it uses anxiety because anxiety is impossible to ignore. It demands your attention in a way that gentle suggestion never could. Here's how to recognize this sign in your own life. Ask yourself, in the last year, has your anxiety become more specific? Has it concentrated around particular themes even when your external circumstances don't necessarily warrant it? Are you finding yourself anxious about things that aren't actually happening in your life yet? Situations you'd have to seek out, roles you'd have to claim, actions you'd have to take. Pay close attention to anxiety that seems disproportionate or out of context. If you're terrified of something that isn't actually threatening you right now, that's often your unconscious showing you where you're meant to go. The terror isn't warning you away, it's marking the territory of your becoming. Let me give you another example. David worked in corporate middle management for 12 years. Comfortable job, decent pay, clear path forward. Then, around age 40, he developed intense specific anxiety about money, not because he was in financial trouble, but because he kept having ideas about starting his own consulting practice. Every time the idea surfaced, his mind would flood with financial catastrophizing. You'll go broke. You'll lose everything. You can't afford to take that risk. You'll fail and end up worse than where you started. For 2 years, David tried to make the anxiety go away. He assured himself he'd stay at his corporate job. He told himself he was being irresponsible, even thinking about leaving. He tried to convince himself his ideas about consulting weren't realistic. But the anxiety wouldn't relent. It actually got worse. Every staff meeting felt suffocating. Every project felt meaningless. And the anxiety about money kept intensifying even though his financial situation was stable. Finally, David worked with a Jungian trained coach who asked him the key question: what if your anxiety about money is actually your psyche preparing you to become financially independent? What if the terror isn't warning you to stay, it's preparing you to leave? This completely reframed David's experience. His money anxiety wasn't evidence he couldn't afford to start his own business. It was evidence that becoming financially self-sufficient was precisely what his soul was demanding. The anxiety was his unconscious forcing him to think about money more seriously than he ever had as an employee, preparing him to handle financial responsibility as a business owner, making him confront his relationship with security and risk. When David finally made the leap and started his consulting practice, the money anxiety didn't vanish, but it transformed completely. It became useful discernment, helping him make smart financial decisions, keeping him accountable, driving him to build sustainable systems. The same energy that had been debilitating panic as an employee became strategic thinking as an entrepreneur. Same energy, different form. Anxiety transformed into strength. This is the pattern you need to recognize. Specific anxiety that seems disproportionate to your actual circumstances is almost always pointing toward your calling. It's not warning you away from danger. It's marking the threshold you're meant to cross. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires crossing thresholds that terrify your current identity. Your ego will generate intense anxiety to try to keep you in place, to protect the familiar, to avoid the death and rebirth process of transformation. But that anxiety, when it becomes oddly specific, is actually yourself, the totality of your potential, using fear to show you the path. There's a terrifying truth here that needs to be said clearly. Your greatest fear often points directly to your greatest gift. Not always. Sometimes fear is just fear, warning you of legitimate danger. But when the fear is specific, persistent, disproportionate, and points to a possibility rather than a danger, When you're more afraid of speaking than of staying silent, more afraid of visibility than of remaining invisible, more afraid of success than of mediocrity, that's not random. That's revelation. Your psyche knows what you're capable of long before your conscious mind can accept it. And it uses anxiety, uncomfortable, undeniable anxiety, to force you to pay attention to possibilities you'd otherwise dismiss as impossible, unrealistic, not for someone like you. So here's your self-assessment. What is your anxiety most specific about right now? Not in general, specifically. What scenario, when you imagine it, creates the most intense physical reaction? What possibility, when it crosses your mind, makes your heart race and your palms sweat? What role, when you see someone else embodying it, makes you feel both terrified and inexplicably drawn? Write it down. Name it clearly. Because that specificity isn't random. It's your unconscious showing you the exact coordinates of your next transformation. It's marking with perfect precision where your trapped power is located and what form it wants to take. And here's the hard part. Once you recognize this, you can't unknow it. Once you see that your specific anxiety is actually a calling, you're standing at a choice point. You can ignore it, medicate it, manage it indefinitely, and the anxiety will persist, maybe intensify, because the unconscious message remains unheeded. Or you can acknowledge it, honor it, and begin moving toward it, even in small ways, and watch how the anxiety begins its alchemical transformation into something else entirely. Jung didn't promise this would be easy. He never said that recognizing the pattern would eliminate the fear. What he said was that once you understand the fear is showing you the way, rather than warning you away, you can make the choice consciously. Stay safe and remain anxious, or risk transformation and discover what your anxiety has been protecting all along. The first sign is the map. Your specific anxiety is showing you exactly where you need to go. The question is, are you ready to stop running from it and start walking toward it? Because that's what comes next. That's what the second sign reveals. Let's look at what happens when you start to recognize that the life you've built, the life that once felt safe and comfortable, suddenly becomes intolerable. The second sign that your anxiety is transforming into strength is visceral, undeniable, and often completely bewildering when it first appears. You wake up one morning and the life that used to feel comfortable, maybe even good, suddenly feels like a cage. Your job, which you've done competently for years, now feels suffocating. Your relationships, which used to provide security, now feel constraining. Your daily routine, which used to offer stability, now feels like a prison schedule you didn't consent to. You look around at the life you've carefully built, the life you thought you wanted, and you can't breathe. Nothing has objectively changed. Same job, same home, same people, same rhythms, but your internal experience has shifted so dramatically that you barely recognize yourself. You feel trapped, desperate, like you're being slowly buried alive in a life that no longer fits. This isn't depression, though it's often misdiagnosed as such. This isn't ingratitude or restlessness or a failure to appreciate what you have. This is what Jung called the death of the provisional life, the life you built based on what you should do, what was expected of you, what seemed safe and responsible and socially acceptable. And your psyche is done with it. Jung observed this pattern so consistently that he considered it a necessary stage of individuation. He wrote about people living provisional lives, lives constructed on external values, societal expectations, family programming, or simply the path of least resistance. These lives aren't necessarily bad, they're just not true. They're not aligned with the actual self that lives beneath all the conditioning and adaptation. For years, sometimes decades, a provisional life can function. You get up, go to work, maintain relationships, pay bills, check boxes. There might be a vague sense that something's missing, a quiet wondering if this is really all there is, but it's manageable. The anxiety, if present, is background noise. But then something shifts. Your true self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, the totality of your being, including your unrealized potential, starts pressing against the constraints of your provisional life. And it doesn't press gently. It makes your current life so uncomfortable, so intolerable, that you simply cannot continue living this way without making a change. The claustrophobia isn't metaphorical. People describe it as physical, chest tightness, difficulty breathing, the walls closing in, the desperate need to escape but having nowhere to go because the cage is your entire life. This is your psyche's strategy, and it's brutal but effective. Make the old life impossible, so you'll be forced to build a new one. Let me tell you about Sarah. At 34, she had what looked from the outside like an enviable life. Successful career in pharmaceutical sales, high income, company car, expense account, regular travel. She'd worked hard to get there, overcome obstacles, built security her working-class parents never had. She should have been proud. She should have been satisfied. Instead, she started waking up every morning with her heart racing, feeling like she was trapped under a weighted blanket. Getting ready for work felt like preparing for battle. Sitting in client meetings felt like suffocating. Flying to conferences felt like being transported to prison. Nothing had changed about the job. Same responsibilities, same compensation, same colleagues, but everything had changed about her experience of it. She went to her doctor, convinced something was medically wrong. Clean bill of health. She tried anti-anxiety medication. It dulled the edge but intensified the numbness, the sense of living in a fog. She tried therapy focused on stress management, work-life balance, boundary setting, minor improvements, but the core feeling remained. Trapped. Then she started working with a Jungian analyst, and the very first session he asked her, "What would you be doing if you weren't doing this?" The question made her cry, which surprised her. She hadn't let herself even think about that question for years, but suddenly she was telling him about the writing she used to do in college, the creative projects she'd abandoned when she got serious about career, the voice inside her that wanted to make meaning rather than just make money. She was describing a completely different life, and as she spoke, she could barely breathe. Not from anxiety, but from recognition, from the pain of seeing clearly what she'd given up. Her analyst said something that changed her entire framework. Your anxiety isn't about your job being stressful. Your anxiety is your psyche making your current life unbearable, so you'll finally have the courage to change it. The claustrophobia is intentional. This reframe was radical for Sarah. She'd been trying to make the anxiety go away so she could keep doing the job. But what if the anxiety was trying to make the job impossible so she'd finally leave? What if her psyche wasn't trying to help her cope with her current life, but was trying to force her out of it? Over the next 18 months, Sarah made significant changes. She cut her expenses dramatically. She started writing again just an hour each morning before work. She began investigating ways to transition out of corporate sales. The anxiety didn't disappear during this period. In fact, it intensified as she got closer to making the leap, because now she was consciously threatening the security her ego had built its entire identity around. But the quality of the anxiety changed. The claustrophobia lessened. She could breathe again, even in the midst of fear about the future, because she was finally moving in alignment with her actual self. 2 years after that first therapy session, Sarah left her sales job and was supporting herself as a freelance writer and communications consultant. The anxiety transformed into creative energy, into productivity, into the vitality that comes from finally living authentically. Here's what's critical to understand. Sarah's provisional life wasn't wrong or bad. It had served a purpose: financial security, professional credibility, life experience. But it had an expiration date, and when that date arrived, when her psyche determined it was time for the next evolution, it didn't send her a polite invitation. It made her current life so uncomfortable she had no choice but to change. This is how the psyche works when your true self needs to emerge. It won't let you stay comfortable in a life that's killing your soul, even if that life looks successful to everyone else. It will create symptoms, anxiety, claustrophobia, depression, physical illness, until you finally pay attention and make the changes you've been avoiding. Jung called this the wisdom of the symptom. Your symptoms aren't random or meaningless. They're your psyche's way of communicating what words cannot express. You're living below your potential. You're betraying your authentic self. You're spending your one precious life doing what you think you should instead of what you actually are. Let me tell you about Michael. He was 42, married with 2 kids, working as an accountant in a stable firm. Good father, faithful husband, reliable employee. His life was fine. Everything was fine, except he started having panic attacks every Sunday night, anticipating the work week ahead. Except he dreaded his alarm clock like it was announcing his execution. Except he'd sit in his car in the parking garage before going into the office, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes, trying to force himself to walk through those doors one more time. Michael's first response was to try harder. He read books on job satisfaction, practiced gratitude, reminded himself how lucky he was to have stable employment in uncertain times. But the claustrophobia intensified. He started having intrusive thoughts during meetings. I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. He'd look at his colleagues and feel like he was watching them through glass, like they were in one world and he was in another, trapped. His wife suggested couples therapy because the stress was affecting his marriage. But in one of those sessions, the therapist asked him a question no one had asked before. Michael, if you could do anything with your life, regardless of money or practicality, what would it be? He answered immediately without thinking. I'd teach. History, specifically. He'd always loved history, read voraciously about it, gotten his undergrad degree in it before getting practical and going into accounting. He'd taught a few classes at community college in his 20s, but given it up when he needed to make more money. The therapist, who had some Jungian training, helped him see that his panic attacks weren't about having too much stress at his accounting job. They were about spending his life doing work that had no soul for him, while the work that did have soul, teaching, sharing knowledge, helping people understand history, went unlived. His psyche was staging a rebellion. The claustrophobia was the pressure of his actual vocation, trying to break through the structure of his provisional career. It took Michael 3 years to make the full transition. He started teaching night classes while keeping his accounting job. He got his teaching certification. He applied for high school teaching positions. He took a significant pay cut to accept his first full-time teaching role. His wife had to go back to work full-time. They downsized their house. It was scary. It was uncomfortable. It required sacrifices. But Michael's panic attacks stopped. The Sunday night dread disappeared. He still gets nervous before teaching new material or dealing with difficult situations, but it's the nervousness of engagement, not the terror of entrapment. The claustrophobia is completely gone because he's no longer living in a cage. He's living in a life that actually fits who he is. This pattern shows up across every imaginable circumstance. The lawyer who suddenly can't stand the adversarial nature of law and realizes she's meant to mediate and heal. The corporate executive who feels suffocated by the politics and realizes she's meant to build something of her own. The stay-at-home parent who loves her children but feels her identity dissolving and realizes she needs work that's hers alone. the small business owner who built something successful but feels trapped by his own creation and realizes he's meant to teach rather than execute. In every case, the claustrophobia is the same. A life that once fit or seemed to fit becomes unbearably constraining because something larger is trying to be born and there's no room for it in the current structure. Here's how Jung explained this. The first half of life is about building a life, establishing security, creating relationships, developing competence, finding your place in the social world. This is necessary and appropriate, but somewhere around midlife, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, the psyche shifts priorities. It stops caring about external success and starts demanding internal authenticity. It stops rewarding adaptation to social roles and starts punishing betrayal of the true self. This shift creates a crisis because everything you built in the first half of life, your career, your relationships, your identity, your routine, was constructed for different purposes than what the second half demands. And the psyche will not let you continue living according to first half values when second half work is due. It makes the old life unbearable until you build a new one. The claustrophobia you're feeling isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's a sign that something's right with you. Your psyche is functioning exactly as it should, alerting you that you've outgrown your current container and need to build a larger one. But here's the terrifying part. Building a larger container means breaking the current one. You can't expand gradually. You have to shatter what exists and rebuild something new. This is why the claustrophobia comes with such intense anxiety. Your ego knows, even if not consciously, that responding to this feeling will require you to blow up parts of your life that took years to build. It will require admitting you were wrong, or that you've changed, or that what once served you no longer does. It will require disappointing people, facing financial uncertainty, losing social status, becoming someone new. Your ego would rather you stay anxious but safe than become free but different. So it amplifies the fear, hoping you'll medicate the claustrophobia, manage it, cope with it, tolerate it indefinitely. And many people do. They live decades feeling trapped in lives that don't fit, never making the changes their psyche is demanding, dying with their actual life unlived. Jung saw this as the greatest tragedy, not physical death but psychological death. The death of the soul that happens when someone refuses the call to transformation and spends their remaining years maintaining a life that stopped being true years ago. So here's your self-assessment. Have you been feeling claustrophobic in your own life recently? Not just stressed or overwhelmed, but actively trapped. Do you find yourself looking at your daily routine and feeling like you're living someone else's life? Do you drive to work and feel like you're driving to prison? Do you sit in your own home and feel like you're visiting a place you don't belong? Does your calendar fill you with dread instead of engagement? Do the people in your life feel like characters you're performing for rather than connections that nourish you? Do you catch yourself daydreaming about completely different lives, not as fantasy but as desperate longing? If yes, this isn't pathology. This is the second sign your psyche is making your provisional life intolerable because your actual life is trying to be born. The claustrophobia is the labor pain, the pressure of something larger, trying to emerge from something smaller, the inevitable discomfort of transformation. And here's what you need to understand. This feeling will not go away by making small adjustments to your current life. You cannot meditate the claustrophobia away. You cannot therapy talk yourself into being comfortable in a cage. You cannot gratitude practice yourself into accepting a life that doesn't fit. The only thing that resolves this particular anxiety is structural change, changing not how you cope with your life, but changing the life itself. This doesn't necessarily mean burning everything down tomorrow. Jung was practical. He understood that transformation requires wisdom, timing, and often gradual transition. but it does mean acknowledging the truth. Your current life has an expiration date, and that date may have already passed. The claustrophobia is your soul's eviction notice. The question becomes, how long will you try to stay in a home you've outgrown? How many more mornings will you wake up feeling trapped? How much anxiety are you willing to tolerate to avoid the fear of change? Because here's what Jung observed. The people who finally respond to the claustrophobia, who finally make the changes their psyche is demanding, almost universally report the same thing afterward. They say, "I can't believe I waited so long. I can't believe I thought I could continue living that way. I didn't know how much it was costing me until I finally got free." The claustrophobia you're feeling isn't punishment. It's preparation. Your psyche is making your old life impossible, so your new life can become inevitable. And the anxiety that comes with it, that's not evidence you're breaking down. It's evidence you're breaking open. But there's a third sign that often accompanies this claustrophobia, something even stranger and more difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It's something happening in your body, beneath conscious awareness, preparing you for the person you're about to become. Let's look at what happens when your body knows before your mind does. The third sign is both the most subtle and the most undeniable. While your conscious mind is still debating, rationalizing, trying to figure out what's happening, your body has already begun the transformation. You start experiencing moments, sometimes lasting seconds, sometimes minutes, where you feel inexplicably powerful, capable, different. You're driving to work, the same commute you've done 1,000 times, and suddenly there's this surge in your chest. Not anxiety, not panic, but power. It lasts maybe 30 seconds and then it's gone, leaving you confused, wondering if you imagined it. You're sitting in a meeting and you feel this strange electricity in your hands, like you're holding energy you don't know what to do with. You're having a conversation and you suddenly feel completely different, present, confident, articulate, and then just as suddenly, you're back to your normal, anxious self. These moments are bizarre. They don't make logical sense. Nothing in your external circumstances has changed to warrant feeling powerful. You haven't accomplished anything new or overcome any significant challenge. The feeling seems to come from nowhere, unconnected to anything you can identify. So you dismiss it. You think it's random, meaningless, maybe even evidence that something's wrong with you. But Jung would tell you something completely different. Your body is not confused. Your body is preparing. What you're experiencing are the first embodiments of your emerging self. Your unconscious power testing the waters of consciousness, trying on your body like a new suit, seeing if it fits yet. Jung studied the body's role in psychological transformation extensively. He understood that the unconscious doesn't communicate only through dreams and thoughts. It communicates through somatic experience, through physical sensations that carry psychological meaning. And when major transformation is imminent, when unconscious contents are about to break through into consciousness, the body begins experiencing them before the mind can conceptualize them. Think of it this way. Your psyche knows you're about to become more powerful. It knows capacities are about to emerge that you don't currently possess, and it begins preparing your physical system to hold that power, to embody those capacities before your conscious identity has caught up. These preparatory moments feel strange because your mind hasn't yet accepted what your body is already learning. Let me tell you about Jennifer. She'd been in therapy for anxiety for 2 years, making progress but still struggling when she started experiencing what she called power surges. She'd be washing dishes or folding laundry, completely mundane activities, and suddenly she'd feel this rush through her body, this sense of absolute capability, like she could handle anything, create anything, be anything. It would last maybe a minute, sometimes less, and then it would dissolve. leaving her feeling confused and slightly disappointed. She mentioned it to her therapist, expecting him to pathologize it as another anxiety symptom or dismiss it as stress-related. Instead, he asked her to start tracking these moments carefully. When did they happen? What was she thinking about when they occurred? How did they feel physically? What happened immediately after? Over several weeks of tracking, a pattern emerged. The power surges happened most frequently when Jennifer was alone, when she was engaged in creative activity, even mundane creative activity like arranging flowers or rearranging furniture, and when she was thinking, even briefly, about starting her own business, something she'd dreamed about for years but had been too terrified to pursue. Her therapist, trained in somatic psychology with a Jungian orientation, explained what was happening. Her future self, the version of her that runs her own business, that embodies entrepreneurial energy, that carries creative authority, was beginning to inhabit her body in brief moments. These weren't random surges. They were her unconscious showing her, through direct physical experience, what it would feel like to be who she was meant to become. The power wasn't coming from outside her. It was coming from inside her, from depths she didn't know she had access to. And the reason it felt so strange, so unconnected to her current reality, was because it wasn't her current self experiencing it. It was her emerging self, trying out her body, preparing the physical system for the transformation to come. Jung called this the somatic unconscious, the way unconscious contents manifest through body sensations before they can be integrated into conscious awareness. He observed this consistently. Before someone stepped into their power psychologically, their body would begin experiencing that power physically. Brief moments of feeling capable, strong, certain, alive. These were the unconscious practicing embodiment. Here's what's happening mechanically. Your nervous system is literally being rewired. The person you're becoming will require a different nervous system capacity than the person you currently are. If you're meant to speak in front of thousands, your nervous system needs to learn to hold activation without collapsing into panic. If you're meant to lead teams, your body needs to learn to maintain grounded presence under pressure. If you're meant to create work that will be publicly judged, your system needs to develop resilience to criticism. Your unconscious knows this, and it begins training your body before your mind is ready, giving you brief experiences of the embodied state you'll eventually need to sustain. This is why the power surges feel so fleeting at first. Your system can only hold that level of energy for short periods. But as transformation progresses, these moments increase in frequency and duration. Your body is building capacity. Let me give you another example. Thomas had been struggling with social anxiety since adolescence. By his mid-30s, he'd tried everything: exposure therapy, medication, cognitive restructuring, mindfulness practices. He'd made some progress, could function in social situations, but still experienced intense anxiety in groups, especially when attention was on him. Then something strange started happening. Occasionally, maybe once every few weeks, he'd be in a social situation and he'd feel completely different. Not less anxious, different. He'd suddenly feel present, grounded, genuinely interested in the people around him. His voice would deepen, his posture would change. He'd speak more fluidly, make better eye contact, feel comfortable in a way that was completely foreign to his normal experience. These moments never lasted long, usually just a few minutes, but they were so distinct from his baseline that he started to wonder if he was dissociating or having some kind of episode. He mentioned it to his therapist, concerned. His therapist asked him a crucial question. In those moments, how do you feel about yourself? Thomas thought about it. Powerful, he said, surprising himself with the word. Like I'm someone people would want to listen to. His therapist smiled. That's not dissociation. That's your actual self breaking through. Your anxious self isn't who you really are. It's who you became to protect yourself. What you're experiencing in those moments is the person you would have been if you'd never needed that protection. And your psyche is showing you, through direct experience, that person is still in there waiting. This reframe changed everything for Thomas. Instead of pathologizing the powerful moments as symptoms, he began recognizing them as glimpses of his emerging self. He started paying attention to what triggered them, what supported them, what made them last longer. He noticed they happened more often when he was rested, when he'd been creating something, when he was around people who respected him rather than people he was trying to impress. Over time, with intentional practice and therapeutic support, Thomas learned to access that state more deliberately. The power surges became power states. What had been fleeting moments became sustained presence. His social anxiety didn't disappear completely, but it transformed from a constant, debilitating baseline to occasional nervousness that no longer controlled his behavior. This is the pattern. Your body begins experiencing your future self before your mind can believe it's possible. These experiences aren't hallucinations or fantasies. They're real, embodied states that your unconscious is making accessible to show you what's available, what's waiting, what you're capable of becoming. Here's why this matters. Most people experiencing power surges dismiss them. They think they're stress-related adrenaline, random fluctuations, meaningless noise in an anxious nervous system. They don't track them, don't pay attention to them, don't recognize them as the immensely valuable information they actually are. And so they miss the roadmap their own body is providing. But when you understand these moments as communication from your unconscious, when you start tracking them carefully, when you begin recognizing the contexts that support them, everything changes. You're no longer just suffering anxiety and hoping it will go away. You're actively engaged with the transformation already underway in your body, cooperating with the process rather than fighting it. Jung taught that the body doesn't lie. Your conscious mind can deceive you, your thoughts can mislead you, your beliefs can be wrong, but your body tells you the truth about what's real in your psyche. When you feel powerful, even for 30 seconds, that power is real. It's not fake, not imagined, not a trick. It's your unconscious letting you experience, in embodied form, a capacity that already exists within you, but hasn't yet been integrated into your conscious identity. The power you feel in those moments isn't something you need to achieve or earn or develop from scratch. It's something you need to claim, to recognize, to integrate. It's already yours. Your body is just showing you what your mind hasn't been willing to accept. Here's your self-assessment. Have you been experiencing power surges, moments where you suddenly feel inexplicably capable, confident, present? Times when you catch yourself thinking, I could actually do that, about something that usually terrifies you. Physical sensations, tingling in your hands, energy in your chest, heat rising through your body that don't correlate with anxiety but feel like activation, like potential. Start tracking these moments. Write them down immediately when they happen. What you were doing, what you were thinking about, how it felt physically, how long it lasted. Look for patterns. You're not documenting random nervous system fluctuations. You're mapping the territory of your emerging self. And here's something crucial. Don't try to force these moments or make them happen. You can't manufacture authentic power surges through willpower, but you can create conditions that support them: adequate rest, creative engagement, time alone, practices that help you connect with your body, situations where you feel genuinely respected rather than evaluated. One more critical point: distinguish between power surges and anxiety spikes. They can feel similar because both involve intense activation, but there's a key difference. Anxiety spikes feel like threat, your body mobilizing to fight or flee from danger. Power surges feel like capacity, your body organizing toward possibility. Anxiety contracts, Power expands. Anxiety makes you want to escape. Power makes you want to engage. If you're not sure which you're experiencing, ask yourself, in this moment, do I feel like I want to run away or step forward? Am I collapsing or expanding? The answer will tell you whether you're experiencing fear or emerging strength. Jung observed something that many modern approaches miss. Transformation happens in the body before it happens in the mind. Your body is always ahead of your consciousness, already living into your future self while your thoughts are still caught in your past identity. The power surges are your body's way of saying, I'm ready, I can hold more, I'm preparing for what's coming. And what's coming, as the fourth sign reveals, often appears first as fascination, a strange, inexplicable, almost obsessive interest in the very things that terrify you most. Let's explore why you can't stop watching, reading about, and studying the exact things your anxiety says you could never do. The fourth sign is paradoxical, confusing, and if you're experiencing it, you've probably questioned your own sanity. You develop an intense, almost compulsive fascination with the exact things that scare you most. The IOU's writer who can't stop watching successful authors' interviews. The terrified entrepreneur who obsessively studies business podcasts at 3 a.m. The socially anxious person who binge-watches charismatic speakers and leadership talks. The person paralyzed by fear of visibility, who spends hours scrolling through Instagram accounts of people living boldly, publicly, unapologetically. On the surface, this makes no sense. Why would you be drawn to what terrifies you? Why would you spend your limited energy studying people who embody the exact capabilities you're convinced you'll never have? It feels masochistic, self-torturous, like you're deliberately rubbing salt in the wound of your own inadequacy. But Jung would tell you something radically different. This isn't masochism. This is preparation. You're not torturing yourself by watching these people. You're unconsciously studying your own future. Your psyche is showing you who you're about to become, and your ego is terrified because accepting that future means destroying your current identity. Jung called this fascination with the shadow, but not the shadow in its purely negative sense. He understood that the shadow contains not just the parts of ourselves we've rejected because they're dark or shameful, but also the parts we've rejected because they're too powerful, too bright, too threatening to our carefully maintained self-concept. These disowned capacities, confidence, creativity, authority, visibility, power, live in the shadow just as surely as our rage or shame or selfishness. And when these positive shadow elements are ready to be reclaimed, when your psyche has determined it's time for you to integrate these capacities, it uses fascination to draw your attention. The people you can't stop watching aren't just random successful individuals. They're mirrors reflecting aspects of yourself that you've disowned but are now ready to reclaim. Your obsessive interest isn't envy or admiration, it's recognition. Let me tell you about Lisa. She'd struggled with social anxiety her entire adult life. Public speaking was her worst nightmare. Even the thought of speaking in a meeting would trigger panic attacks. She'd built a career where she could stay behind the scenes, contribute without visibility, avoid any situation where attention would be focused on her. Then, around age 38, something strange happened. She started watching TED Talks compulsively, not just occasionally, obsessively, hours every night. She'd watch the same speakers repeatedly, studying their gestures, their vocal patterns, the way they commanded attention. She subscribed to speaking coaches on YouTube, downloaded books on public speaking, joined online communities discussing presentation skills. All of this terrified her. She had no intention of public speaking. She had no reason to need these skills. The entire fascination felt absurd, even embarrassing. She hid it from her friends and family because she couldn't explain it. Why was she spending all this time studying something she'd never do? Her therapist, when she finally mentioned it, asked a question that stopped her cold. What if you're not studying them because you admire them? What if you're studying them because you are them, and your unconscious knows it? Lisa's first reaction was to laugh. Her? A speaker? Impossible. She couldn't even order coffee without anxiety. How could she possibly be a speaker? But her therapist pushed. Your anxiety about speaking isn't evidence you're not meant to speak. It's evidence that speaking is exactly what you're meant to do, and your ego is terrified of what claiming that power would require you to become. The fascination isn't random. It's your psyche preparing you, showing you that this capacity exists within you, training you through observation before you're ready to practice. Over the following months, Lisa began to understand. She wasn't watching these speakers because they were different from her. She was watching them because they were showing her who she could become. Every technique she absorbed, every strategy she learned, every pattern she recognized, her unconscious was filing it away, preparing her nervous system, building a template for a future that her conscious mind couldn't yet accept, but her psyche knew was inevitable. 2 years later, Lisa gave her first professional presentation. 5 years later, she was a speaking coach herself, teaching anxious professionals the very skills she'd once been terrified to use. The fascination hadn't been random. It had been curriculum. Her unconscious had been training her long before her conscious mind was ready to admit what she was training for. This is the pattern Jung observed repeatedly. We become fascinated with people who embody our disowned power, not because we're different from them, but because we're about to become like them, and our psyche is using fascination as a teaching tool, as preparation, as evidence of what's possible for us. The mechanism is elegant. Your unconscious knows you're about to claim a certain capability, speaking, leading, creating, building, whatever it is. But your ego isn't ready. The gap between your current identity and your emerging identity is too vast to cross in one leap. So your unconscious creates a bridge. Fascination. It makes you obsessively interested in people who already embody what you're about to become. You study them. You absorb their energy. You begin to internalize their patterns, their confidence, their way of being in the world. Your conscious mind thinks you're just watching, just admiring, just passing time. But your unconscious is doing something far more sophisticated. It's building neural pathways. It's teaching your nervous system what it feels like to be confident, powerful, visible. It's preparing your body to hold capacities you don't currently possess. It's showing you that what you think is impossible is actually just unfamiliar. Here's the key insight. The people you're fascinated by aren't special. They're not fundamentally different from you. They simply claimed and integrated capacities that you've kept in your shadow. They said yes to possibilities you've been saying no to. They chose transformation where you've been choosing safety. And your fascination with them is your psyche's way of saying, look, this is who you actually are once you stop hiding. Let me give you another example. Marcus worked in IT, had for 15 years, stable, behind-the-scenes work. He was good at it, reliable, competent. But around age 42, he developed an inexplicable obsession with entrepreneurs. He started listening to business podcasts during his commute, reading founding stories at night, following startup culture obsessively. He knew all the major players, could quote their philosophies, understood their strategies. His wife thought it was a harmless hobby. His friends figured he was just interested in business news. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The fascination had a quality of desperation, like he was studying for an exam he didn't know he was going to take. He'd watch interviews with founders and feel this strange mixture of terror and longing, like they were living a life that was somehow meant to be his, but he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. When Marcus finally talked to a career coach with Jungian training, She asked him directly, "Are you studying these entrepreneurs because you want to become one?" The question made him physically uncomfortable. "I don't know," he said. "I mean, I've thought about it, but I'm 42, I have a mortgage, kids in school, I can't just—" She interrupted him. "I'm not asking if it's practical, I'm asking if it's true. Is this who you're meant to be?" Marcus sat with that question for weeks, and slowly, reluctantly, he had to admit, yes. The fascination wasn't random, it was calling. He'd spent 15 years building security, and now his psyche was demanding that he use that security as a launchpad for the real work he was meant to do. The entrepreneurs he was obsessively studying weren't people he admired from a distance. They were versions of himself he was terrified to become. 3 years later, Marcus had left his IT job and started his own consulting firm. The transition was terrifying. There were times he wanted to quit and go back to the safety of employment, but he couldn't. Something in him had shifted. He'd seen through the fascination to the truth underneath. This wasn't someone else's life he was watching. It was his own life, calling to him through the examples of people who'd already said yes to their version of the same call. Now here's where this gets psychologically sophisticated and where Jung's insight becomes crucial. The fascination works because it bypasses your ego's defenses. If your conscious mind tried to imagine you as a speaker, leader, entrepreneur, creator, whatever terrifies you, your ego would immediately flood you with objections, doubts, evidence of why it's impossible. But when you're watching someone else do it, your ego relaxes. You're just watching. There's no threat. And in that relaxed state, your unconscious can do its work, absorbing patterns, building capacity, preparing you for a future your conscious mind would reject if proposed directly. This is why the fascination feels almost compulsive. Your unconscious knows this is essential preparation, and it overrides your conscious priorities to make sure you get the training you need. You tell yourself you're just going to watch one TED Talk, and 3 hours later you've watched 20. You tell yourself you're just curious about that podcast, and suddenly you've subscribed to 10 more. You're not weak-willed or undisciplined. You're being educated by your own psyche in exactly what you need to know for your next evolution. But here's the shadow side of this pattern, and it's important to acknowledge. Some people get stuck in permanent fascination. They become professional students of other people's success, eternal admirers of other people's courage, perpetual consumers of other people's transformations. They collect the inspiration but never take the action. They study the path but never walk it. Jung warned about this. Fascination, by itself, changes nothing. It's meant to be preparatory, not permanent. If you've been fascinated for months or years but still haven't taken even the smallest step toward embodying what you're studying, you're using fascination as a defense against transformation rather than preparation for it. You're allowing yourself to feel close to the power without having to claim it. You're living vicariously through others instead of living authentically as yourself. The healthy pattern is this. Fascination leads to recognition. Recognition leads to decision. Decision leads to action. Action leads to embodiment. But many people stop at fascination, endlessly consuming content about transformation while never actually transforming. They tell themselves they're learning, preparing, not ready yet. But what they're really doing is avoiding the terrifying moment of actually stepping into their power. So here's your diagnostic. Have you been fascinated by people who do what you're afraid to do? Have you been obsessively consuming content about capabilities you claim you don't have? Have you been studying success in an area where you claim you have no business succeeding? Ask yourself honestly, how long have you been fascinated? If it's been weeks or months, you're probably in healthy preparation. Your unconscious is training you and you're almost ready. But if it's been years, if you've been watching, studying, consuming for years without taking meaningful action, then fascination has become avoidance. You're stuck in the spectator role when you're meant to be a participant. Here's the hard truth Jung would offer. The people you're fascinated by aren't more talented, more gifted, more special than you. They're just more willing. They said yes where you're still saying maybe someday. They risked identity death where you're still clinging to identity preservation. They chose transformation where you're still choosing comfort. And your fascination with them is actually self-recognition. You're not watching strangers do impossible things. You're watching yourself, your potential self, do absolutely possible things. The terror you feel when you imagine doing what they do isn't evidence that you can't. It's evidence that you can, and your ego knows that claiming that capability will require you to become someone completely different than who you are now. Here's how to work with this sign rather than being trapped by it. First, acknowledge the fascination. Stop dismissing it as random interest or guilty pleasure. Recognize it as your psyche showing you something important. Second, ask directly, what do these people embody that I'm being called to embody? Not what skills they have, but what way of being they represent. Confidence, visibility, authority, creative freedom, independence. Name it clearly. Third, and this is crucial, take one small action in the direction of that way of being. Not a huge leap, not quitting your job or making a massive change, but one action that proves to yourself and your psyche that you're willing to move from fascination to embodiment. If you're fascinated by speakers, record a 60-second video of yourself speaking. If you're obsessed with entrepreneurs, register a business name. If you can't stop studying artists, create one piece of art and show it to one person. The action doesn't need to be perfect or significant by external measures. It needs to be authentic, a genuine step across the threshold from admiring to becoming. And when you take that step, you'll feel something shift. The fascination will begin to transform. You'll move from "I could never do that" to "I'm learning to do that," to eventually "I do that." Jung observed that the terror-fascination paradox resolves only through action. As long as you stay in fascination, the terror remains because you're still identified with your limited current self, looking at an impossible future self. But the moment you take action, even small action, you begin bridging the gap. You're no longer purely spectator, you're becoming participant, and the energy that was bound up in fascination begins to release into actual embodiment. Here's what's simultaneously terrifying and liberating about this sign. Your fascination is evidence that you already are what you're afraid to become. The capacity isn't out there in them, it's in here in you. They're not showing you what's possible for someone else. They're showing you what's inevitable for you once you're willing to stop hiding. The people you're obsessed with aren't your heroes. They're your mirrors. And the reason you can't look away is that you're catching glimpses of yourself. Not who you are now, but who you're about to become, if you can find the courage to stop watching and start living. But fascination and studying only take you so far. There's another realm where your unconscious communicates even more directly, more symbolically, more powerfully. A realm where it stops being subtle and starts showing you, in vivid detail, exactly what transformation looks like. Let's talk about what happens to your dreams when massive change is on the horizon. The fifth sign is one Jung considered most reliable, most direct, most impossible to dismiss once you understand the language. Your dreams, if you've been paying attention to them, suddenly become extraordinarily vivid, intensely symbolic, and undeniably meaningful. Not the usual scattered, half-forgotten fragments of daily processing, but dreams so powerful they wake you up, so clear you remember them months later, so loaded with imagery that they feel more real than waking life. If you've dismissed dreams as random neural firing or meaningless subconscious static, Jung would tell you you're missing the most direct communication channel between your unconscious and conscious mind. He spent decades proving that dreams aren't noise. They're signal. They're the unconscious speaking in its native language of symbol and image, telling you truths your conscious mind isn't ready to hear in plain language. And when major psychological transformation is imminent, when anxiety is about to alchemize into strength, when your true self is about to break through, your dreams don't just become slightly more interesting. They become initiatory. They become teaching. They become roadmaps showing you, in precise symbolic detail, exactly what's trying to happen in your psyche. Jung called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, agreeing with Freud on this point, but interpreting dreams very differently. Where Freud saw dreams as disguised wishes, Jung saw them as honest communications. Where Freud looked for pathology, Jung looked for potential, and what he discovered was that pre-transformation dreams follow consistent patterns, using universal symbols to show the dreamer what their psyche is preparing them for. Let me tell you about the most common pre-transformation dream themes, and as I describe them, notice if any feel familiar. Notice if you've had dreams like these recently, especially if they've been recurring or unusually vivid. Theme 1. Being given weapons or tools. This is one of the most frequent pre-transformation dream patterns. You dream that someone, often a wise figure, sometimes a stranger, occasionally someone from your past, gives you a weapon, tool, or object of power. A sword, a key, a book, a staff, a crown. The dream has a ceremonial quality, like you're being initiated or knighted. You wake up feeling the weight of the object in your hands, even though it was just a dream. Jung interpreted these dreams as the unconscious, announcing that you're being given power, capability, authority. The specific object matters. Swords suggest cutting through illusion or defending boundaries. Keys suggest access to what was locked. Books suggest hidden knowledge. Crowns suggest authority or sovereignty. But the general message is clear. Your psyche is telling you that you now have access to power you didn't have before. You're being equipped for what's coming. Robert came to therapy suffering from intense anxiety about assertiveness. He'd spent his whole life avoiding conflict, appeasing others, suppressing his own needs to keep peace. His anxiety had become so severe he was having physical symptoms, chest pain, digestive issues, chronic fatigue. Then he started having a recurring dream. He'd be in various situations, sometimes his workplace, sometimes family gatherings, sometimes just walking down a street, and a figure would appear and hand him a sword. Different figures in different dreams, an old man, his deceased grandfather, a woman he didn't recognize, but always the same sword. Heavy, ornate, unmistakably powerful. They'd place it in his hands and say something like, "It's time," or "You'll need this now." Robert had no idea what it meant. He wasn't violent, didn't fantasize about hurting anyone, couldn't understand why his dreams kept giving him weapons. His therapist, trained in Jungian dream analysis, explained the sword represented his capacity for healthy aggression, for cutting through others' manipulations, for defending his own boundaries, for asserting his truth even when it created conflict. His psyche was telling him, in the clearest symbolic language possible, that he now had permission and actually the necessity to claim his power. Over the next year, as Robert worked on assertiveness, boundary setting, and healthy anger expression, the dreams changed. He'd dream of actually using the sword, not to harm, but to cut through ropes binding him, to defend himself from attacks, to clear paths through obstacles. His unconscious was showing him his own progress, affirming the work he was doing in waking life. Theme 2. Discovering hidden rooms. This is another extraordinarily common pre-transformation dream. You're in a familiar place, your childhood home, your current house, a workplace you know well, and you discover a door or passage you've never noticed before. You open it and find entire rooms. sometimes entire wings, sometimes whole additional floors you never knew existed. Often these rooms are beautiful, filled with valuable objects or bathed in unusual light. Sometimes they're dusty and need renovation, but clearly have immense potential. Jung saw these dreams as the unconscious revealing itself to the conscious mind. The house is you, your psyche, your being, your totality. The familiar areas are your conscious identity, what you know about yourself. And the hidden rooms, those are aspects of yourself that have always existed, but have been unconscious, unexplored, unavailable to your awareness. The dream is showing you that you contain vastly more than you've known, that there are entire dimensions of your being waiting to be discovered and inhabited. These dreams often coincide with people beginning to recognize capacities they didn't know they had. The anxious person discovering they can be calm under pressure. The timid person discovering they have a powerful voice. The logical person discovering creative ability. The independent person discovering capacity for intimacy. Whatever has been repressed or undeveloped, the hidden rooms represent its emergence into conscious awareness. Theme 3. Battle or confrontation dreams. As transformation approaches, many people start dreaming of battles, fights, confrontations, but with a particular quality. These aren't helpless nightmare scenarios where you're being chased or attacked without defense. These are dreams where you're actively engaged in combat, where you're fighting back, where you have power even if you're not certain you'll win. Sometimes you're fighting a dark figure, what Jung called the shadow personified. Sometimes you're fighting a monster or animal. Sometimes you're in an actual war or battle scenario with armies and weapons. The specific imagery varies, but the core pattern is consistent. You're no longer passive victim, you're engaged combatant. Jung taught that these dreams represent the ego's struggle with unconscious contents. The battle is the psychological work of integration, your conscious self grappling with aspects of your unconscious self that are trying to break through. The enemy in the dream isn't actually your enemy. It's the power you haven't yet integrated, appearing as adversary because your ego experiences its emergence as threat. And here's what's crucial. These dreams are positive signs. They mean you're no longer repressing or avoiding. You're engaged. The fight itself is the integration process, and often as therapy or inner work progresses, the dream battles resolve, either through victory, truce, or the remarkable transformation of enemy into ally. Theme 4. Flying or superhuman abilities. Many people approaching breakthrough start dreaming of flying or of having supernatural abilities. Super strength, the ability to move objects with their mind, healing powers, telepathy, invulnerability. These dreams feel ecstatic, liberating, almost addictively good. You wake up disappointed to be back in normal reality. Jung interpreted these as compensation dreams, the unconscious compensating for waking life limitations by showing you what you're capable of experiencing. But they're also preparatory. They're teaching your psyche what liberation feels like, what it's like to move without constraint, to have power without limit. They're expanding your sense of what's possible for you. For anxious people specifically, flying dreams often emerge right before major anxiety transformation. Because anxiety is constriction, limitation, being weighed down, trapped. And flying is the opposite, freedom, elevation, transcendence. The unconscious is showing you that the opposite of your current state exists within you, that you contain the capacity for the exact inverse of what you're suffering. Theme 5. Natural disaster, followed by rebuilding. This is often the most disturbing pre-transformation dream pattern, but also one of the most significant. You dream of earthquakes, floods, fires, hurricanes, massive natural disasters that destroy familiar structures. Sometimes it's your home that's destroyed. sometimes an entire city, sometimes the whole world. The destruction feels apocalyptic, terrifying, total. But here's what distinguishes these as transformation dreams rather than anxiety dreams. There's an aftermath. The dream doesn't end with destruction. You see the rebuilding begin, or you find yourself surviving and stronger, or there's a sense in the dream that the destruction was necessary, that something new can now be built. Jung recognized these as psyche death and rebirth dreams. The natural disaster represents the necessary destruction of your current identity structure before the new self can emerge. It's the psychological equivalent of a forest fire that clears dead wood and makes space for new growth. Your old life, your old identity, your old understanding of yourself has to be destroyed, not because it was bad, but because it's now too small for what you're becoming. These dreams are particularly common for people approaching major life transitions, career changes, relationship endings that lead to new beginnings, relocations, identity shifts. The unconscious is preparing you. Yes, something will be destroyed. Yes, it will feel catastrophic, but it's not ending, it's transforming. And what rises from the ashes will be more true, more powerful, more aligned with your actual self. Theme 6, meeting a wise figure. Often right before major breakthroughs, people dream of meeting a wise figure, an old man or woman, a spiritual teacher, a historical figure they admire, sometimes a version of themselves, aged and powerful. This figure gives them guidance, shows them something, teaches them, or simply meets their eyes with knowing recognition. Jung called these figures manifestations of the self, the wise, transcendent center of the psyche that contains all your potential and knows your path even when your conscious ego is lost. When the self appears in dreams, it's almost always a sign that major integration is happening. The wise figure represents the part of you that's never been anxious, never been lost, always known who you're meant to become. These dreams carry a quality of blessing, of being seen and recognized for who you truly are. People often wake from them with tears, feeling like they've been given permission or validation or confirmation for something they were afraid to claim. Theme 7, threshold or gateway dreams. Finally, there are dreams of standing at thresholds, doorways, gates, borders, edges of cliffs or rivers. You're on one side and something unknown is on the other. Sometimes you cross in the dream. Sometimes you stand at the threshold, afraid. Sometimes you're preparing to cross when you wake up. These are literal threshold dreams, your unconscious showing you that you're at a psychological threshold, a point of no return, a place where decision is required. The threshold represents the transition from old self to new self, from familiar to unknown, from safe to transformed. Jung taught that these dreams often come when a person is hesitating, standing at the edge of necessary change, but unable to commit. The dream is showing you you're here, you're at the threshold. The only question now is whether you'll cross. Now, here's what you need to understand about all of these dream patterns. They're not random, they're not meaningless, and they're not just your brain processing daily stress. These are your unconscious mind's sophisticated communication system, showing you in the only language it speaks fluently exactly what's happening in your psyche. When your dreams suddenly become intensely symbolic, when you start having dreams that feel significant even if you don't understand them, when dream imagery stays with you for days or weeks, your unconscious is trying to get your attention. It's saying major transformation is underway. Here's what it looks like. Here's what you need to know. Here's what's trying to happen. And the beautiful thing is, you don't need to become an expert dream interpreter to benefit from this. Simply paying attention is powerful. Start keeping a dream journal. The moment you wake, before moving or fully opening your eyes, recall the dream and write it down. Even fragments, even just the feeling or core image. Do this consistently for 30 days and you'll start seeing patterns. Notice recurring symbols, repeating themes, dreams that feel particularly charged or significant. You don't need to fully decode them, though working with a Jungian therapist can be immensely valuable, because simply bringing conscious attention to your unconscious communications already facilitates integration. The act of remembering, recording, and respecting your dreams tells your unconscious, I'm listening, I'm paying attention, I'm willing to receive what you're showing me. And when you do this, something remarkable happens. The dreams often become more clear, more direct, more helpful. It's as if your unconscious realizes you're finally paying attention and starts communicating more explicitly, giving you more obvious guidance. Here's your self-assessment. Have your dreams intensified recently? Have you had dreams that feel unusually significant, that you can't shake, that carry emotional weight beyond normal dreams? Have you noticed any of the 7 themes I described? Weapons, hidden rooms, battles, flying, disasters, wise figures, thresholds. If yes, understand this. Your unconscious is actively guiding your transformation. It's showing you what needs to die, what needs to be born, what capacities you're gaining, what thresholds you're approaching. Your dreams are a blueprint, and the more you learn to read them, the more you can cooperate with the transformation already underway. Jung believed that paying attention to dreams during major life transitions could cut years off the transformation process, because dreams tell you what's happening beneath consciousness. They let you work with your psyche instead of against it. They show you where resistance is, where fear is, where power is waiting. They give you the roadmap. And here's something fascinating. People who do this work, who pay attention to their dreams during anxiety transformation, almost universally report the same progression. Early in the process, dreams are chaotic, scary, overwhelming. As transformation progresses and anxiety begins converting to strength, dreams become more empowering, more battles won, more successful flying, more confident threshold crossings. And finally, as integration completes, dreams often become almost peaceful, showing the new identity stabilized, the new life established, the transformation complete. Your dreams are showing you the future before your waking life has caught up. They're living in tomorrow while you're still struggling in today. And if you pay attention, if you learn their language, if you respect their guidance, they'll help you cross the bridge from who you are to who you're meant to be, with far less suffering and far more clarity than if you try to do it blind. But dreams aren't the only way your unconscious communicates that transformation is near. There's another sign, one that plays out in your waking life, in your relationships, in how you experience other people. It's uncomfortable, often painful, and absolutely necessary. Let's talk about what happens when you suddenly can't tolerate fake anymore. The 6th sign is one of the most socially disruptive, one of the most relationship challenging, and one of the most undeniable indicators that your true self is emerging. You develop an almost violent intolerance for inauthenticity, not just mild discomfort or preference for genuine connection, an actual, visceral, physical revulsion to anything fake. Fake people, performative relationships, shallow conversations, personas, pretense, social games, empty politeness, strategic friendships, networking that's really just using, compliments that don't mean anything, questions asked without genuine interest in the answer, and most painfully, your own mask, the version of yourself you've been performing for years, suddenly becomes unbearable to maintain. You're at a party where you used to function fine, and suddenly every conversation feels like fingernails on a chalkboard. You're in a meeting where people are posturing and positioning, and you have to physically restrain yourself from calling it out. You're with friends you've known for years, and you realize with horror that you don't actually know them at all. You know their personas, and they know yours, and none of it is real. Small talk becomes excruciating. Surface-level friendships feel hollow. Professional networking feels like prostituting your soul. You find yourself withdrawing from social situations, not because you're anxious in the old way, afraid of judgment or rejection, but because you simply cannot stand the inauthenticity. You'd rather be alone than fake one more interaction. If this is happening to you, your first response might be to pathologize it. My social anxiety is getting worse. I'm becoming bitter or cynical or judgmental. There's something wrong with me that I can't even enjoy normal social interaction anymore. But Jung would tell you something completely different. Nothing is wrong with you. Something is right with you. Your authentic self is emerging, and it simply cannot coexist with the persona you've been wearing. This isn't social anxiety worsening. This is integration beginning. This is your true self rejecting what's incompatible with it. Let me explain Jung's concept of the persona, because it's essential to understanding this sign. The persona is the mask you wear in the world, the socially adapted version of yourself, the face you show to others. Jung was careful to point out that having a persona isn't pathological. It's necessary for functioning in society. You can't show up to every situation as your raw, unfiltered self. The persona allows you to navigate social complexity, meet role expectations, maintain appropriate boundaries. The problem comes when you identify with your persona, when you mistake the mask for your face, when you forget that who you are socially isn't who you are essentially. And the catastrophic problem comes when your persona becomes so thick, so developed, so defended, that your authentic self can barely breathe underneath it. This is what happens to most people by their 20s or 30s. They build a persona that works, that gets them hired, liked, accepted, successful, and then they spend decades maintaining that persona, defending it, perfecting it, until they can't remember what they're actually like when no one's watching. The persona becomes a prison, and they're the prisoner who doesn't remember being free. But here's what Jung discovered. When the self, your totality, your actual being, decides it's time for individuation, it will not tolerate the persona anymore. It simply won't. And it will create such intense discomfort with inauthenticity that you'll be forced to either drop the mask or suffer unbearably. This is what's happening when you suddenly can't stand fake. Your authentic self is demanding to be lived, to be expressed, to be present in your relationships and your work and your daily life. And it's making all the inauthentic stuff so intolerable that you'll have to choose. Keep the mask and suffer, or risk showing your real face. Let me tell you about Amanda. She was 39, successful marketing executive, large friend group, active social life, respected in her field. From the outside, she seemed to have it all together, confident, outgoing, always knew what to say, could work a room like a professional. Then something shifted. She started dreading social events she used to enjoy. She'd be at dinner with friends she'd known for years, and realized she was performing. Every story she told, every laugh, every response was calculated to maintain an image. And suddenly she couldn't do it anymore. The effort was crushing. She'd go home from these gatherings exhausted, not from socializing, but from performing. She started noticing how inauthentic her friendships actually were. None of these people knew her real struggles. None of them knew she'd been in therapy for anxiety. None of them knew she was questioning everything about her life. She'd built friendships based on who she appeared to be, and now that version of herself felt like a stranger. The breaking point came at a networking event, the kind she used to excel at. She was mid-conversation with a potential client, doing her usual charming and competent routine, and she felt physically ill. Not anxiety, not panic, just revulsion at her own performance, at the emptiness of the interaction, at the prostitution of her presence for professional gain. She walked out, left her coat, left the event, went to her car, and cried. not from sadness, but from recognition. She couldn't do this anymore. She'd rather lose clients, lose friends, lose social status than continue performing authenticity while being fundamentally fake. Her therapist helped her understand this wasn't breakdown, this was breakthrough. Her authentic self was finally strong enough to reject the persona that had protected her for decades. The intolerance wasn't judgment, it was discernment. It was her soul saying, not this, not anymore. I need real. Over the next 2 years, Amanda's entire social world transformed. Some friendships deepened as she risked being real and found that a few people could actually meet her there. Many friendships dissolved as she stopped performing and discovered there was nothing underneath. They'd been persona-to-persona relationships all along, with no authentic connection beneath the social dance. She lost some professional opportunities because she stopped networking inauthentically. But she gained different opportunities, ones based on genuine connection, on people responding to who she actually was, rather than the image she projected. The transition was painful. There were months of loneliness as old relationships fell away and new ones hadn't yet formed. There were times she questioned whether being authentic was worth it, whether she should just put the mask back on and go back to her old life.